Imagine eating a piece of fruit. You leave it sitting for a few days. It becomes soft, its smell changes, and when you taste it, something strange happens. Your body feels different. Your mind feels lighter. You become warm, relaxed, and maybe even dizzy. But here's the strange part. Nobody had invented alcohol yet. Nobody knew what fermentation was. Nobody understood yeast. So how did humans discover one of the oldest substances in human history? The answer may have started with something incredibly simple: rotten fruit. Long before bars, bottles, breweries, or vineyards existed, early humans were already surrounded by a world full of natural fermentation. Fruit contains sugar, and when wild yeast comes into contact with that sugar, fermentation can begin. The result? A small amount of alcohol. This can happen naturally in fallen fruit, tree fruits, berries, honey, and other sugary foods. So the first alcoholic drink may not have been something humans deliberately created. It may have been something they accidentally discovered. Imagine an ancient human walking through a forest. They find some fruit lying on the ground. It doesn't look completely fresh anymore, but they're hungry, so they eat it. And this time, something feels different. Maybe they notice a strange taste. Maybe they feel warmer. Maybe they become unusually relaxed. Maybe they simply remember that particular fruit. And that tiny discovery could have been repeated. But there is an important question. Did ancient humans actually drink naturally fermented fruit? We cannot know exactly what the very first human experience was. There is no prehistoric diary saying, "I found some fermented berries today." But archaeology gives us something much more interesting. Evidence shows that humans were producing fermented drinks thousands of years ago. One of the oldest strong pieces of evidence comes from Jiahu in ancient China. Researchers found traces suggesting that people were making a fermented drink from rice, honey, and fruit more than 9,000 years ago. Think about what that means. Humans were making alcoholic beverages long before modern chemistry, long before written recipes, long before anyone knew what microorganisms were. They had somehow discovered that certain ingredients could be transformed into something completely different. And eventually, humans became much better at controlling the process. Instead of waiting for nature to accidentally ferment fruit, they started creating the conditions themselves. They could collect sugary ingredients. They could store them. They could crush fruit. They could mix grains with water, and then they could wait. This is where one of the biggest discoveries in human food history begins: fermentation. But fermentation isn't simply food becoming rotten, it's a biological process. Tiny organisms, especially yeast, consume sugars and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. Humans didn't understand this for most of history, but they didn't need to. They only needed to notice the result. If one batch tasted good, they could make another, and eventually people began passing the knowledge from one generation to the next. This may have transformed alcohol from an accident into a technology, and alcohol wasn't always about getting drunk. For ancient societies, fermented drinks could have had many different uses. They could be part of ceremonies, they could be connected to religion, they could be used during celebrations, they could help bring people together. And in some societies, fermented beverages may even have been safer to consume than certain untreated water sources, although this depended heavily on the drink and how it was produced. But there was another reason alcohol became so important. It changed human behavior. People gathered together. They shared drinks. They celebrated. They performed rituals. They told stories. They made social connections. In other words, alcohol wasn't just a chemical. It became part of culture. And that may explain why alcohol survived for thousands of years, because humans weren't simply producing a drink, they were producing an experience. But there is an even stranger possibility. Some researchers have proposed that our attraction to alcohol may have extremely deep evolutionary roots. There is a famous idea called the Drunken Monkey Hypothesis. The basic idea is that our primate ancestors may have encountered naturally fermented fruit for millions of years. If ripe fruit smelled strongly of fermentation, animals that could detect and consume these calorie-rich foods may have gained an advantage. But this doesn't mean our ancestors were constantly getting drunk in the forest. That's a popular exaggeration. The evidence suggests something much more subtle. Our attraction to the smell and taste of certain fermented foods may have ancient evolutionary connections, and humans eventually took that natural process and pushed it much further. We learned to ferment grains, fruit, honey, milk, and eventually, almost anything containing the right ingredients. From simple natural fermentation came beer, wine, mead, and countless other traditional drinks. The fascinating thing is that humans discovered all of this without knowing what was actually happening at the microscopic level. For thousands of years, people were using yeast. Without knowing yeast existed, they were controlling fermentation. Without understanding fermentation, they were creating alcohol without knowing what alcohol was. And that tells us something important about human intelligence. Some of our greatest technologies didn't begin with scientific understanding. They began with observation. Something happened. Humans noticed it, they repeated it, they improved it, and eventually, they turned an accident of nature into a technology. So when did humans start drinking alcohol? We may never know the exact moment. There was probably no single first drink, no single person who discovered it, no ancient inventor who suddenly said, "Today I will create alcohol." Instead, it was probably a very long process. Fruit fermented naturally. Humans noticed, they experimented, they learned, they passed the knowledge on. And thousands of years later, we are still drinking the result. The next time you see a bottle of wine, a glass of beer, or even a piece of overripe fruit, remember what you're looking at, not just a drink, but the result of one of humanity's oldest experiments, with nature itself. An experiment that may have started with nothing more than a hungry human and a piece of forgotten fruit.